Hi, I'm Mary Keena, Livestock Environmental Management Extension Specialist for NDSU Extension, and I'm here to talk about controlling weed seed spread through manure management. Okay, so we're here to talk about using livestock manure as a fertilizer because of the current pricing situations. So the objectives then for this presentation are to talk about the differences between stockpiling and composting manure and understand those differences. Understand why it's important to keep track of where you're applying manure. Talk about the nutrient availability when using manure or compost as a fertilizer, and talk about manure management to decrease weed seed germination. And so we'll talk about all these things today. And I tried to put a flow to this presentation, but sometimes I have to jump back and forth a little bit. And so I did put my contact information at the end of the presentation. So if I lose you along the way, please feel free to contact me. Okay, so what is manure? So most of us know that manure is a mixture of feces and urine that can include other things, bedding, spilled feedstuffs, hair, soil, really anything that's in that pen is going to be considered manure. It's going on the truck and being hauled out to the field. However, it's also nutrients. So we think of the big three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There's also sulfur, and then there's a whole ton of micronutrients as well. So the average finishing beef animal, so this is one that's going to market over a 153-day feeding period, produces 55 pounds of nitrogen, 7.3 pounds of phosphorus, and 38 pounds of potassium. And so those numbers come from the American Society of Agricultural Engineers. Those are the numbers that are used when we are designing or engineering feedlots. Okay, so before we go too much further, we need to talk about the difference between stockpiling manure and composting manure. So stockpiling manure is when we push our manure up in our pens and let it set. And composting manure is when we push our manure up in our pens and we turn it several times throughout the season. And so most often, livestock owners will push their manure up in the spring, they let it set, they let the pens dry out during the summer, but they also see a volume reduction happen when they stockpile. When composting occurs, they push that same manure up into the same pile, but then they turn it several times or agitate it several times throughout the summer. And so what that does is that allows all parts of the compost or of that manure to go into the inside of that pile and it heats. And so composting, the major difference between stockpiling and composting is stockpiling go through one heat cycle and composting goes through several heat cycles. We'll talk more about composting later, but I just wanted to get that general difference out of the way. So when we're talking about stockpiling, it's generally a fresh manure, and that's how we treat it in the field as a fertilizer. And when we're talking about composting, we treat that differently. That's important to know if it's stockpiled or if it's composted, so that when we're going to use it as a fertilizer, we give it the proper credit. Okay, so manure stacking or stockpiling guidelines in North Dakota. So there's short-term and there's permanent manure stockpiles. So manure cannot be stockpiled for more than 9 months at a time in a short-term stockpile location, and the same location cannot be used from year to year. And so oftentimes people will compost in one area of their yard, and then they'll spread that, and then the next year they'll compost somewhere else. Permanent manure stockpiles are stockpiles that you're going to find on like a permitted feedlot operation where they put their manure there year after year after year. It's stockpiled there until it's time to haul out. And so short term would be more of an edge of field type situation, or if you're composting. All right, and so this is important whether you're stockpiling or whether you're going to compost, whether you're going to store something on the edge, even on the edge of your field. Um, Sandy soils have rapid permeability, loamy and clay soils have slower permeability, and so it's important to keep in mind what kind of soil we're dealing with when we're deciding where we want to store that manure or compost before we spread it, or if we're going to compost it or do something different with it. So depth to groundwater and location of surface water are also very important to know because there's nutrients, as we talked about earlier. All right, so stockpiling site selection, again, here manure, it says manure, but also compost. Stockpiles cannot be located in gravel pits, along streams, within floodplains, certain distances to private and public wells, And you can cover it. In some states, it's required that the stockpile is covered to reduce odors and flies, and more so to reduce nutrient runoff. Here, it's not a requirement, but if you're going to do that, anchor securely because the wind is always on in North Dakota. Okay, so why are we talking about this? Like I said earlier, the current pricing situation is a little out of control. But also, there's a handful of folks who have never used manure who are interested in using manure, whether that's because you're looking at it from a soil health aspect, you're looking at it from a crop and livestock integration aspect. Your neighbors have manure and you want to use it. This is the year that you're really going to get interested in that. And so there are other things that come with manure that we need to talk about. I'm all about you using it, but we need to make sure that all of us are on the same page. Okay, so this lovely weed is one of the reasons we're talking about weed seed management in manure, but maybe more so the pigweed family in general. So water hemp is also another weed that is spread very easily, rapidly, and can be spread through manure as well. I bring up Palmer amaranth because we've talked about it a lot in NDSU Extension for the last couple of years, and so very likely you've heard of this. It's a summer annual, it's native to Southwest US, and it's also on the North Dakota noxious weed list. Okay, so this weed is not just a problem in the agronomy industry, it's also a problem in the livestock industry as well. So a lot of times this weed comes in on feed that we're feeding, whether that's grain screenings, hay, bedding. So it comes in from the field, we then feed it to our livestock, and then it goes back out on the field via manure. And so this is just a picture to show you that this is Palmer amaranth growing out of. Okay, so how is this weed spread? It can be spread through all of the things you see here, but I want to point out hay or livestock feed. So we saw the previous picture, and we also see the picture on the right of some livestock screenings that have weed seeds in them, as well as it's spread through manure and basically anything that moves seed. So pretty general there. One question I've been getting over the past year is, does composting help manage these hard to control weeds? And so yes is the answer, but like anything, management is key. So if you're going to compost, we need to make sure that we are getting that pile up to temp, and we also have the proper moisture in there, the proper carbon and nitrogen, and we're turning it on time. And so there's a lot of management that goes into making that compost. Okay, so there are some studies that have been done in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and this was back in the late 90s. So ensiling corn before feeding it to cattle can reduce weed seed viability. Ruminant animals can also reduce this. So if you have ensiled corn and it goes through ruminant, it reduces it even more. It kills more weed seeds. And then if we look at the difference in seed types when it comes to ensiling and composting and ruminant digestion, like this is true no matter what management technique we want to use. Small, hard seeds are harder to kill than larger, softer seeds. So when you look at this table then on the right, the gist of this is the higher the temp, the more seeds are killed and the faster. So temp is a big factor in this. However, Wisconsin and Minnesota also determined that moisture is a big factor as well. So we have an online composting workshop. The University of Minnesota and North Dakota State University Extensions got together and made an online composting workshop during the summer of 2020. So today we're going to just breeze over composting. This was an entire day workshop when we did it in person. The online composting workshop that's available at this link here is 13 different videos that you can go through. And so we'll do it no justice in a half hour. But I just want to give you this opportunity to, if you want to go to this link, you can watch the videos and do it at your own pace. They're still up there, still relevant information. Composting is a mixture of organic residues that have been piled, mixed, moistened, and they go through thermophilic or heat-loving decomposition. So the heat is the part that I talked about on the last slide, which we need to make the compost work. Results are a crumbly, low odor, stable, nutrient-rich soil amendment. And so when I say stable, composting actually changes the form of nitrogen that's in the manure, or now compost. So it changes it from um, more available to less available, less stable to more stable. And so that's why it's important to know if you are stockpiling manure, if you're using composted manure, because of the nutrient availability that's there. So this benefits, composting I think benefits both the crop producer and the livestock owner. Whether you're looking for a reduction in parasite load and volume, or pathogens, or if you're looking for uniformity in a final product. And so we're getting the uniformity as well as everything else if we're composting properly. And uniformity is nice because when you're out spreading this product on a field, you don't want a clump of straw and then a pile of manure and another clump of straw. You just want it to be uniform across the field. So like I said earlier, we're just going to breeze through composting. And so the general gist of composting is you need to select a site, which is very similar to our stockpiling guidelines from earlier. So we want a well-drained area. We don't want a surface or groundwater contamination concerns. After site selections comes the carbon to nitrogen ratio, moisture, and temperature. So for moisture, we're looking at 40 to 65% of the pore space being moisture. And so what we do is called a wet rag test. And so if you've ever wrung out a wet rag and you have water just pouring out of it, you're over 50% moisture. And if you have wrung it out and nothing comes out, it's dry and it kind of falls apart a little bit, you're under 50% moisture. And if you have a little bit of water that comes out, but it's not soaking wet, you're probably around 50%. And so what we do is we just put on a glove, stick our hand in the middle of the pile, pull it out and squeeze, and then see what we have there for moisture. So 50% is ideal. The temperature, ideally 131 degrees for 15 days. We're killing pathogens, we're killing parasites, we're killing weed seeds, and we're getting a uniform product. We're also changing the form then of the nitrogen that's available. Mixing helps maintain that temperature. It also helps maintain the oxygen levels. And so we need the oxygen levels to be greater than 5% of the pore space to keep it aerobic, or heat or air loving. And so we need air or oxygen to be in that environment. We mix every 10 days to 2 weeks. And so I go by temp. But it's easier sometimes to mark it on the calendar and go by time. And so there is a correlation between 10 days and 2 weeks and the temps that we're needing to keep that up to about 131 degrees Fahrenheit. So when is it done? The temperature does not spike anymore. So we turn it and we know that the carbon and nitrogen ratio is proper, and we know that the moisture is proper, and we know we've done everything correctly and it doesn't spike anymore. Then we know that the compost is done. And so it can be as little as 6 weeks or up to 6 months, depending on how you're managing that pile. So these are just some mixing tools I'm going to show you. So we have a brown bear turner, and this actually takes the pile from one row and moves it over to the other side. And so some people like to use this right in their pens when they're composting. And then we have another kind of turner. So this one on here specifically is a Vermeer, but there are several companies that make turners like this where you actually just pull it down the row. And so when you're pulling it down the row, it doesn't change it like the brown bear moves it from one to another. This just actually mixes it right where it's at. Of course, you can use a payloader or a bobcat, a skid steer, whatever you have available on your place. I always tell folks to start with what you have, see if it's something you're really interested in, and then move up in equipment. A payloader is very likely something that you have on your place already, especially if you have livestock, whereas a compost turner, which can be 35 to 70 grand, isn't really something that we all keep in our shed. And so of course, you get a more uniform product when you're using the compost turner, but the payloader does the job as well. So now what? We have this compost that we say is done. We've turned and mixed and temped and moistened and done all the things. It doesn't come up to temp anymore, and we say it's done. Okay, so now we let our pile cure. And basically what this means is we're just going to push it into a pile and we're going to let it set to come to ambient temperature, so the air around us. What's the temperature around us? Really what we're doing is just letting the microbes in there chill out. We don't want to go spread what we would call hot compost because then we're going to get some tie-up of nutrients in the soil. Nutrient consideration. So this is where it's important. A stable source of nitrogen is what we've made with this compost. However, it's also less available. So it's more of a slow release nitrogen product than our fresh manure. So 20% of the nitrogen that's in the compost is available the first year for plant growth, whereas 50% is available when we're looking at fresh manure. So we're going to go ahead and spread at agronomic rates as fertilizer. And we know then what we have in that fertilizer because we're going to sample it. And so you can always call your NDSU extension agent. You can call me with questions about sampling. These are some labs that we use that have that do sample manure. And so you can call them and ask them for a manure sampling kit. And then this publication, Solid Manure Sampling for Nutrient Management Planning, gives you step-by-step instructions on how to sample the manure, and you can use the same sampling procedure for compost as well. Okay, so now we're going to get into some numbers, and this may be where I'm going back and forth a little bit, and so try to stick with me here. I'm hoping that in a few slides I can wrap it up and then we can see the value as we come to a close. So how many dollars are produced? And so by how many dollars are produced, I'm meaning how many dollars are produced in manure. So we have one finishing beef animal. We talked about that animal quite a while ago in the presentation. They make 64 pounds of manure a day. And you might be thinking, holy smokes, that's a lot of manure. But also keep in mind that, remember, manure is not just the poo, it's also the other stuff too, the spilled feedstuffs, the bedding, all the stuff mixed together. So 64 pounds a day is what the American Society of Agricultural Engineers says that a finishing beef animal makes per day. We have 153 days in a feeding period, and that makes about 4.9 tons of manure per feeding period for that one animal. Okay, and so on the previous slide, I talked about sampling. So we've sampled this manure then, and we know that there's 13 pounds of nitrogen, 6 pounds of phosphorus, and 12 pounds of potassium per ton of manure. You know that because you sent it in. If you don't send your manure sample in, you can always use the nutrient characteristics of solid beef manure publication seen here on the right. However, I will always encourage you to send your manure in, especially if you're looking to either as a livestock owner sell it to a crop producer or as a crop producer use it as a fertilizer. We really like to know exactly what's in your manure. Okay, so we sampled it. We know this is what we have. These are the average numbers for North Dakota for a solid beef manure. I called a couple elevators the last week of December and got some numbers on urea and potash and 1034O, and I did some calculations, and so these are the average dollars per pound for those nutrients. And so when I use those times the amount of nutrient that's here, we have $30.60 of nitrogen, $12 of phosphorus, and $23 of potassium per feeding period. So that equals $66 of NPK per head per feeding period. So that's what that animal is making. Now, if you have 500 head of finishing animals for 153 days, you're making $33,000 of manure setting out there. So $66 isn't going to fill the pickup now, but $33,000 is a little bit more. And so there is a value to that manure that's out in that pen. Okay, and so now more numbers in dollars per acre this time. So I took the same numbers, 13, 6, and 12. That's the average nutrient analysis for NPK per ton of manure. And I multiplied those by the dollar per pound. And so we know that there then is $6.11 of nitrogen per ton of manure, 246 of phosphorus, and 456 of potassium. So total then $13.13 of NPK per ton of manure. I multiplied that by what a calibrated manure spreader spreads. This is the number that I used out in the field when I was calibrating my spreader. And so I know that I've spread $307.24 per acre of NPK out there. Now, most of us are actually going to be spreading around 30 ton an acre. That's a more common number for North Dakota, and so that's about $400 an acre. And at 35 ton, we have about $459 an acre. Okay, so on this slide, we're going to talk about nitrogen and phosphorus calculations. So you can also do this for potassium. I'm going to talk about N and P because they're a little more common and what we're more worried about. But for potassium is actually 90% available in both manure and compost during the first year for plant growth. So back to NNP, we're going to use the 23 again, so 23 ton an acre because I calibrated my spreader, which we'll talk about next. And I know that's what I was spreading. We know we have 13 pounds of nitrogen per ton of manure because we sampled. And so now we have 304 pounds of total nitrogen that's available. However, because it's fresh manure, only 50% of it is available the first year. So 152 pounds is available the first year for plant growth. And if it's compost, only 20% of that's available. So we go from 152 pounds available to 61 pounds. So this is why it's super important to know what you're spreading out there, how much and what. So we're spreading 304 pounds of nitrogen, but we're only using, there's only 152 pounds that we can use this year, or 61, depending on if it's compost or stockpiled manure. We do that same calculation then for the for the phosphorus that we're putting out there. And phosphorus is 80% available the first year, and so we're spreading 140 pounds, but 112 is available the first year for growth. When we're spreading manure or compost for nitrogen needs, which we almost always do in North Dakota, we're almost always over applying phosphorus. And so we're spreading more phosphorus than we need. So typically if you're spreading manure at a nitrogen rate, you don't have to add extra phosphorus from a commercial fertilizer. So manure spreader calibration is something that I think everybody should do if they're going to use manure, whether you're a crop producer or a livestock owner, whether you spread it all the time or you're going to spread it only this year because of prices. So if you spread commercial fertilizer, you very likely calibrate your own spreader, or you expect the person who is spreading to have done that. And so I think it should be the very same for spreading manure. How do you know what you've put out there unless you've calibrated that spreader? So there's the sheet or tarp method is a very simple field test that you can do, or field calibration. You can also, of course, drive across a scale or use truck scales. There's methods for that in the same publication here, the Manure Spreader Calibration Pub. It gives you line by line on what to do for using scales, and it also then gives you the sheet method. And so what we do here is we just have a bucket and a tarp of known area. We record our tractor gear and RPMs and spreader settings. And then we apply the manure and we weigh it. So here's just a quick, we've weighed the bucket with the tarp in it. We lay it out, we anchor it down, we drive across after we've recorded our settings. And so then the pounds of manure on the sheet equal tons of manure applied to the land. So there's some quick calculations in that publication that I gave you. They're very simple to do. And then you get pounds of manure equals tons of manure applied to the land. So tons per acre. And that's where I came up with the 2340 that I'm using in all my examples. Okay, so I just went through all of those numbers and all of the calculations to basically tell you that value is really up to you. You guys call me, both crop producers and livestock owners call and say, hey, I got this guy that wants the manure, what's it worth? And then the crop guy calls and says, hey, I'm going to get this manure, what's it worth? And so I go through those calculations that I just did. That's what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you to get the analysis, get the nutrient analysis. Tell me what's in it. Call the local elevator and get some prices. Sit down and run those calculations. They're not hard to do. But then after you have the numbers, so both of you should come up with very similar numbers if you do that. And then you just have to sit down and talk about the rest. So the Christine Moderman from the University of Minnesota is one of my colleagues over there. And she says the only real guideline is that both parties need to feel they are benefiting and getting value out of the arrangement. The arrangement will be different for everybody. So crop producers, reach out to livestock owners and see, hey, would you be interested in getting rid of some manure this year? Livestock owners, let folks know if you have extra and you don't have fields to spread on, or you don't want to use it this year and you just plan on stockpiling it. If you're an AFO or CAFO permitted operation, make sure you're doing your manure transfers. If you're an AFO or CAFO permitted operation, you don't know what that is, come talk to me. And so price, application, manure or compost, all of these things are stuff you're going to have to know. Are you going to work with a custom applicator? Is the price going to include the application? Who's going to apply it? How is it going to be moved? Is it going to be stored on the edge of the field? When is this going to happen? And write it down. Write it down. And this is goes all the way back up then to the beginning of our objectives. Where did you get it and where did you spread it? And why do we need to know that? We need to know because of those weed seeds we talked about, because we want to then manage and monitor those fields to make sure that if there is anything that we have in that manure that's not controlled by our current weed control program, that we can monitor it, know where it's at, know exactly where we put it, and deal with it right away. All right, so working with a custom manure hauler, things you need to know: how much manure do you have? So they're gonna, they're gonna want to know approximately how long that job's gonna take them. Approximately how much do you have? Where are they gonna spread it? So how far away? Because that's gonna also depend on how much time. If they're going 3 miles versus 15. Can they get into the manure storage area with their equipment? And so can they get their big payloaders into your little pens, or can they, have you moved it to a stacking area? So that's something more for the livestock owner. And then can you pay them? And I bring this one up more so because the prices of everything has exploded like crazy. A lot of these guys are based in rural areas. They're coming long distances. Their equipment is expensive just like yours is. And more so, which one of you is going to pay them and how is that going to work? So something to talk about when you're working this out. This is just some of the types of their equipment. A lot of my guys are running truck-mounted spreaders. However, I do have a handful now that have changed to tractor and pull-type spreaders. And so we kind of have both out there: big tractors, big pull-type spreaders, spreading anywhere from 15 to 30 ton per load. And so and then this picture on the left is for my livestock guys or for the crop guys, depending on how you guys work this out. So that is twine and net wrap. And so that gets wrapped around their beaters, and then they have to cut it off and they charge for that. And so if you're getting manure from an area where there's a lot of net wrap and twine, and that's going to be wrapped around their beaters, and they're going to have to stop every 5 loads, that's going to add up too, and that someone's going to have to pay for that as well. All right, so using manure in North Dakota, there are no restrictions as far as when you can use manure in North Dakota. So some states you can start at this month and you have to stop at this month, and you can only spread during these months. Here, there's no restrictions for that. However, you want to be smart about what you're doing. So manure can be applied to frozen ground, but runoff needs to be contained, or runoff is not going to become an issue in the spring. Consider land with slopes of less than 6%, where there's stubble or vegetation, and less than 8 inches of snow on the ground. Don't spread before a big rain event, you guys. We all have phones that have hour by hour forecasts on them, and so don't spread during a large rain event or before or right after, and don't spread where water quality will. All right, so quick review. Stockpiling is pushing manure into a pile. Composting is taking that manure in the pile and turning it through many heat cycles. We are changing the form of nitrogen that's there, and we're changing the availability then too. And so we need to know, was our manure stockpiled or composted, and how are we going to use that differently then? Manure is worth something, but what is it worth to you? It all has to come down to some decent conversations that are going to have to happen this winter. Manure is a great fertilizer. I am very excited that some of you are going to try manure for the first time, but just please know what you're dealing with. Make sure you talk to your agronomists about what you're planning to do and where you're going to apply it. Let them know what your plan is, so that they can get their questions answered before planting season starts. Okay, with that, I have my contact info here. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, give me a call, or send me an email, and I'll be happy to guide you where I can.